In the autumn of 1962, Edith Piaf entered a Paris recording studio. Her doctors had told her to stop. Her body had been failing for years. Rheumatoid arthritis, liver disease, the accumulated physical cost of a life lived at the specific intensity that her life required. The doctors had said, in the direct language that doctors use, that the recording sessions should stop and that rest was the only responsible option. She recorded 4 songs that autumn. They were among the last recordings she made before her death in October 1963. The 1962 sessions were arranged with the specific combination of hope and practicality that marks the management of a career in difficult physical circumstances. The sessions were scheduled for shorter durations. The arrangements were prepared more carefully in advance because the time available for adjustment in the studio was more limited. The production team understood, without anyone saying so explicitly, that what they were doing was working within constraints that had not existed before, and that these recordings would be among the last. She understood all of this. She was not unaware of what the sessions were producing, or of the specific weight of the recordings she was making. She was, at the age of 47, someone who had been a professional performer for 30 years and who understood the relationship between what she was doing and what it cost and what it produced. She was not going to the studio because she didn't understand the cost. She was going because the cost was worth it, and because the alternative, the recordings that would not be made if she stopped, was a cost she was not willing to accept. She was told to stop. She did not stop. This was the paradox of the 1962 sessions. A body that was diminishing, and a voice that was, in some of the accounts of the people who were present, more concentrated, more precisely itself than it had been in the years when the body was strong enough to sustain the full physical performance of what she was singing. What had been spread across the entirety of the performing self, the gesture, the movement, the physical presence, was now held entirely in the voice. The reduction had not diminished, it had distilled. The 1962 recordings are among the most studied of Piaf's output by the people who have written about her work with the most seriousness. What they identify in those recordings is not what you would expect from a body that was failing. They identify a voice that had achieved, in those conditions, something that the longer and more physically supported sessions of earlier decades had not quite reached. The reduction of the performing self to the voice had produced, in those sessions, recordings that felt not like performances, but like statements, direct, unornamented, carrying only what was essential because everything else had been set aside. She was not finished, not in the autumn of 1962, not while there were sessions to attend and songs to record and the machinery of the studio ready to receive what she had to give it. She was not going to the studio because she was defiant or reckless or unable to accept the reality of her own condition. She was going because the recording was not separate from what she was in a way that made stopping it compatible with continuing to be what she was. She was the voice, and the voice was what she had and what she had left to give. Stopping would have been setting aside the only essential thing before it was finished. Piaf had been a recording artist almost as long as she had been a performer. The first recordings came in the 1930s, in the early years of her career, and from that point forward, the recording and the performing had existed in parallel. Different things, requiring different conditions, but both part of the same central activity, making the voice she had into a form that an audience could receive. The stage had always been the primary form. The stage was where she was most fully herself, where the physical presence, the eyes, the hands, the specific way she occupied space, could all be part of the thing she was giving. The recording was the version of that thing that could be made into an object, pressed into a disc, duplicated, distributed, heard in rooms and by people who were not in the original room. The recording was the form in which the voice could be in rooms she would never stand in, heard by people she would never perform for, continuing after the original occasion had passed. For Piaf, who understood that the stage only existed while she was on it, the recording had a particular value. It was what lasted. In the autumn of 1962, she was recording in conditions that were different from any recording conditions she had worked in before. The physical difficulties were visible. The people who worked with her in the studio during those sessions have described the specific character of the sessions, the pauses, the adjustments, the accommodations that were made for a body that was not operating the way it had operated for 30 years. The voice, however, was not one of the things that was failing. She recorded 4 songs in the autumn of 1962. She recorded more in the subsequent months, into 1963, as long as her health allowed sessions to be scheduled. The last sessions took place in early 1963. By October of that year, she was gone. What she left in those recordings is not a document of a dying woman trying to hold on. It is a document of what the thing was in its most essential form when everything that was not essential had been stripped away. The voice that is on those recordings is the same voice that had been on the 1936 recordings, the 1940s recordings, the recordings from the great period of the 1950s. The same in the ways that matter, its specific quality of presence, its refusal of distance from the material, the property that Cocteau had named when he called her the truth. The people who were in the studio with her during those sessions have described the recordings that resulted as something that surprised them, not because they had expected less, but because what emerged from the conditions of difficulty was not diminished, but refined. The voice that arrived at the microphone in 1962 was arriving without the full support of the body that had always amplified it, and what was left turned out to be sufficient, more than sufficient. She understood the cost. She went anyway. And what she recorded in those months is not a final statement, but simply the continuation of what she had always been doing, giving the voice to the only form that could hold it, for as long as the voice was there to give. The doctors had said to stop. She finished when the voice could not go into the studio anymore. And what she left in the machines plays still, arriving in rooms the way she always arrived in rooms, giving what it always gave.